Hello and welcome to the Counterweight podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Elizabeth and I will be talking about the concept of shame and how it applies to society. Okay, hello everybody, welcome back again to the Counterweight podcast. I'm here as usual with my co-host Elizabeth. Hello Elizabeth. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at the concept of shame. And we intend this to be in a kind of a slightly new format of show where we take a deep dive. We maybe look at an article or a series of articles or a book. And we extrapolate from that book and talk about the ramifications from that article. And we talk about the ramifications for the culture war that we're in right now. So we're going to do that today. Before I go any further, I must extend my apologies. I am laboring, as you can probably hear, under something of a nasty head cold. So if I sound a bit croaky, very, very sorry about that. I shall nevertheless try my best to endure and persevere. So the article that we're going to start from today is about shame. And the title of it is Shame Broadcast Social Norms, the Positive Social Effects on Normative Actions and Social and Normative Behavior. And that is by, if I'm not wrong, Rebecca Schoenberg and Samuel Skroek. Is that right?
Well, we apologize if we have not pronounced that right?
Quite,
it did just come out. It's in Psychological Science. It just came out just a month or so ago. So it's hot off the presses. And we picked this article because we've talked many times, right, about the effects of shaming and ostracism. So when we saw this, we thought we might now we should tell everybody that we have not talked about this, right? We've each read it independently, and this is the first time that we will be talking about it together.
Right. So the idea is that we will take these articles, we'll read them, we'll come to our own conclusions, and as much as possible, because obviously we'll talk a little bit like, oh, this is interesting and this is why it's interesting. We'll try and hold back and actually have the discussion live on air or recorded on air, so to speak. So, yeah.
So I wondered if it might be worthwhile for me to just super briefly give the broad overview of the sort of the way that the paper is organized, the way that they did the studies, just very from 1,000 feet away, just super quick. And then we can talk about some of the details and, I'm really interested to hear what your thoughts. I have written all over the back of mine and all over the pages. So I have lots of thoughts. Yes. Okay.
I have some notes.
3x5 cards. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
So in this study, and we'll put the details in the podcast notes. The researchers did 5 studies total, and there's also, I did download the supplementary materials. They did a couple of other studies, and they did post their notes, and they pre-registered the studies and everything. So they did 5 studies total, and they were looking at not at the people who felt shame, but at people who were presumed, the participants presumed that they were witnessing people who felt shame. So the researchers operationalized this with pictures of people who were expressing one of several emotions. The emotion of interest was shame, which was sort of, a downcast, usually a downcast face, or downward-looking face and a downcast gaze. And then there was a neutral expression, an angry expression, and then they had a few other expressions like anxiety and sadness. Also, not in every study, so they did, 5 studies here, so they had different combinations. And so the idea was if they had several business-related scenarios in each of the studies, and presumably the participant was seeing a former participant in the study who had engaged in some form of behavior, usually in a business setting or in a game setting, and then demonstrated this facial expression. And then the participant was asked several questions about what they would do next if they were offered an opportunity to play this. Now you're going to play the game. How would you play the game? And would you engage in that behavior that you saw with a neutral, angry, anxiety, sadness, or shame face? And how would you behave maybe in the business? So they were interested in 3 outcome variables in each study, and those were what they called injunctive norms. And injunctive norms would be sort of justice related, so norms that would be related to judicial kinds of, the idea would be that they would be against the law, sort of. And then they were interested in descriptive norms, so things that would be uncommon for people to do. And then the third outcome variable was behavioral intentions. As I mentioned before, what would the actual participant think that they would do, or in the case of the game, actually do. So that's a very super brief summary. And then in the super brief, also in the spirit of super brief, in all of the studies, to some degree or another, some wildly significant, some not so significant, the participants thought that they would not engage in the behavior, that they saw a fake participant, the picture of the person who had the behavioral, the facial expression of shame. The participants said they would tend not to engage in that behavior, so they had behavioral intentions to stay away from that. They said that the behavior that the person had engaged in was most likely uncommon, and that they should not engage in it. So the other person engaged in the person that they saw engaged in a behavior that was uncommon and probably should not have done. And then the participants said that they would probably not do that either. Again, to some degree or another in each of the studies. So it was a pretty robust finding across all the studies, including the 2 that were not in the article but were in the supplementary materials. So that's
right. So, reading through the article, they said that there was some kind of disconnect with earlier material. So, could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that I don't really think that that's strictly true.
Okay.
Many researchers have suggested that that all emotions have a function, and so just broadly speaking, the 3 functions would be individual adjustment, and that would be I'm sort of rolling along, and I feel, I get stuck. There's an interruption in my flow, and so I have an emotion about that, and the emotion and my memories that I draw on about that interruption, about my situation right now, where I am, what I'm doing. You call up the most sort of relevant information in memory, and you then adjust your behavior accordingly. So that would be a social adjustment function of emotion. And I think that the authors in this case would be sort of referring to that, maybe that shame has been investigated or studied from more of a clinical standpoint, and that social adjustment function, and that many have said that shame is sort of an ugly emotion, which these researchers mention, because it's often felt by people in a clinical setting, maybe for something that they can't actually change or had no part in themselves. So a rape victim might feel shame. A child abuse survivor might feel shame. And that's not something necessarily that would be something they could have changed. Another function of emotion, the two other functions of emotion, though, that these authors kind of skirt, in an effort to make their study sound extra important. Not that I'm criticizing, again, I'm not suggesting that this was not a well done study or that they didn't do something very creative, because they did. But essentially, most emotion researchers would say that there's also a communication function for emotion, which these researchers are interested in, and a social coordination function. So these are all part of, sort of the evolutionary content of emotions and the importance of emotions. So in terms of communication, if we know what others are experiencing, then we can understand why they're doing what they're doing, and we can learn about what we should do. So that's a part of what these researchers are saying, right? Oh, if I see someone else expressing an emotion, I should interpret that and learn what I should do. So the expressions help us understand others, and it helps us hopefully communicate to others. And then the social coordination function, which these authors are also interested in, is sort of the bond that we share through emotions, that we build and commit to a community through emotions. So certainly, in terms of shame, I think that I'm saying this person's name right, Braithwaite, Braithwaite. Braithwaite.
In British English, it would be Braithwaite, but
Braithwaite, okay.
Well, who knows?
Talks about the reintegrative shaming, which would be sort of combining shame with respect. So, you would maybe tell your child, you should be ashamed of yourself for hitting your little sister or brother, right? So I understand that they took your toy but they're little and they don't understand yet, and you have to, so you should be ashamed. Don't beat up on people that are littler than you, right? But you respect that. You also communicate respect. You respect that the child's toy, and it is his or hers, was taken from them, right? And so, and I also respect you enough to know that you likely won't do that again, or you'll work to change your behavior. But then there's disintegrative shame, which is stigmatizing, and that would be sort of when you would lose your community. And people often aren't really interested in recovering from that. That would tend to make them more angry. So there certainly is a broad history of research on shame in terms of communication, I guess is my point.
So this sounds like a good kind of diving off point for me to get involved in a bit. And for the benefit of listeners, I'm working from memory from Michel Foucault's Madness and Civilization. And there's a point in that book where Foucault talks about how mad people aren't necessarily people who are mentally ill, but people who exist on the fringes of society, who are outcast, who are seen as being different. And he talks about two kinds of ways in which they're seen as mad. And the first would be violating an object-based truth, or like an objective truth. So, for example, if there is a man who thinks he's made of glass, he might act within his own rationale, right? So he doesn't want to bump into anything that's of a certain degree of hardness, because he thinks by doing so he will shatter himself. So there is a kind of internal logic within his thinking. That kind of the shame that's brought about by that kind of madness can be rectified, provided that person adjusts his mindset. But even if he doesn't, it's kind of seen as something that's eccentric. It's not something that's particularly damaging. It's sad for him. He's seen as a tragic case, but he's not seen as evil, for lack of a better word. But then there's another kind of person who would be seen to violate a moral truth. Now, from a kind of a postmodern point of view, not even really a postmodern point of view. I mean, certainly earlier philosophers, for example, David Hume, certainly recognized that you can't get an ought to, so a moral ought from an is, so from things that are objectively true, you can't derive any moral principles. But nevertheless, these moral principles are, I think, as Foucault would have observed, in some ways stronger than the more objective object-based observations, right? And so when somebody violates what is perceived to be a moral truth, then the outcasting or the shame that they incur is much, much worse. Do you follow?
Yes. So I will. I'll invoke something much more common. Have you seen the movie Inside Out? The Disney movie Inside Out?
No.
No. Oh, well, you must see it with your children.
Okay.
So the psychology researchers actually it's Pixar. It's a Pixar movie. So they chose 5 emotions in that movie. So they chose joy, sadness, fear, anger, and disgust. And in the movie, disgust is sort of would be the sort of shame aspect. And so disgust, the little character that plays disgust inside of Riley's head, is very concerned about what Riley might wear and how she might be seen in front of her friends and that kind of thing. So this is what's sort of unique about disgust versus embarrassment or guilt. So shame has this element of disgust, this element of contamination, where guilt and embarrassment are more about sort of little faux pas. So think about embarrassment or guilt as if only I hadn't done such and such. So if only I hadn't tripped and fallen, if only I hadn't reached to change the radio right then, I wouldn't have gotten in a car accident, right? Where shame has this element, like I said, of contamination and of disgust and of social rejection. So that would be more like, if only I weren't. So disgust is integral to the person. So they are shame is integral to the person. And so that has that, it has sadness the same way that embarrassment and guilt does, but it also has this element of being unclean, being contaminated. So that's sort of what you're talking about there.
There's a really, again, going back to Madness and Civilization, there's some really interesting stuff. So what Foucault talks about in that book was how in the Middle Ages, leprosy had become like a major, major, major problem. And obviously leprosy, quite a disgusting thing. So these days, if you get treated, it's fine. But obviously back in those days with no effective treatments, really, you'd have people whose body had been deformed and they were sent to live in leprosariums or colonies for lepers to keep them away from the general public so they couldn't contaminate them. And yet there were certain areas in which they were allowed to coexist, albeit at a distance, so that they could beg for money and continue to survive. But what happened by the mid kind of 1300s was that leprosy in Europe essentially began to die out. And so all of these buildings that had been used to house all of these lepers, a few of them could endure, but most of them would either fade into disuse or they'd be replaced with something. And so Foucault talks about how mad people, again, not people who these days necessarily we would recognize as being mad, but those people who would be perceived then as being on the fringes of society, epileptics, for example, might be one, would be placed into these homes and removed from society. So there is this kind of, in the history of European civilization, there seems to be this, as a consequence, or at least coming after leprosy, there seems to be this perception of those people who are being perceived as mad, being perceived as different, being perceived as being on the fringes of society, having some sort of contaminating quality about them, that requires them to be removed. And it's interesting further. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go on.
No, I was going to say, the rhythm is disrupted a little bit by the program we're using. But it's interesting how Foucault then goes to talk about the punishment for people who are mad. So, for example, if you're somebody who is punished for committing an everyday criminal act, you know, you were talking earlier about things that are embarrassing that you did. So, for example, I don't know if I forgot to do my flies up and I was teaching a class and all the students were laughing at me. That's not a moral failing, right? That's an accident anybody could make. It's funny. Yeah, I did it and I will feel embarrassed, but it's not the same as shame. If I did something that might incur shame, for example, let's say when I was a younger man, I stole cars. I didn't, by the way. But let's say that I did, and I had since reformed. You know, I don't. There's a novel called The Mayor of Casterbridge, which talks about this kind of thing. I did it then. I'd since reformed. I recognized why my action was bad. I wouldn't do it again. My character's completely changed. Yet, if those facts then come up, you know, you think about like a shunning on the internet. If somebody said something stupid and homophobic when they were 17, 18 years old, and they would clearly not say that kind of thing now and would be fully against it. And yet those old facts are dredged up. They'll be thoroughly shamed for that, right? But even above that, there seems to be an even higher order of shaming. And the higher order of shaming is sometimes for an individual who might express a moral point of view that might be perfectly reasonable and grounded in evidence, and yet is unrepentant. Who would be even worse than the person who had been outed for saying something homophobic when they were 17 that they deeply regret.
Yeah, so shaming assumes a standard set of morals. So shaming, so people who engage in shaming assume that they do have, the moral high ground, right? And it relies on power and moral authority. It is a power-based emotion. As a social group gets larger, research indicates that they actually focus more on violations than they do supporting and preventing, people from sort of going astray, but they start focusing very much on violations. And so the more power they get and the more moral authority, the stronger they think that their moral authority is, the more they focus in on violations.
But even worse than that, and this is again something that is observed by Foucault and not necessarily backed up by any empirical evidence that I'm aware of, Foucault would point to the kind of person who might steal a car, for example, and be arrested for it. They would be punished. There would be a degree of shame, but the mad person, the person who embodies a different kind of set of moral truths, right? Because these normative moral truths that you're speaking to, they presume an objectivity that they're not really entitled to. You know, if you really subject it to any serious analysis, there's no objectivity there, right? Or at least there isn't for a lot of them. You know, there are some people who would say there is some kind of objectivity to at least some of them, but to a lot of them there isn't. So the person who is arrested for example, for stealing a car and is imprisoned, the shame that he or she or they experience is very, very, very limited. And these people they're imprisoned, they're taken away from view, right? They're hidden from view in their incarceration. But the mad, again, those people who live on the fringes of society, who violate these moral truths, they're made a spectacle of. So again, you think of the contemporary heretics, like ourselves, certainly like you. The people, they didn't want to censure you as in to take you into a room and to say to you, Elizabeth, this is what you've done bad, this is why. Using the same reasoning. They could have done that using exactly the same reasoning that they have done now. Mm-hmm. And they could have censured you and done it in private. But they didn't want to do that to you.
Yeah, right.
They wanted to shame you. They wanted to make you a spectacle.
Yeah, this would be the difference between, like you said, when your child, engages in some behavior that you want to discourage or whatever, you take them aside and you explain it to them. You don't go march into their classroom in school, right? And describe their behavior at home to all of their friends and that kind of stuff. If we have a disagreement with a friend and we actually believe that they're wrong about something, we don't put up a billboard in town, right? So it's the same, it's the same kind of idea that we shouldn't, and that's basically what Braithwaite was saying, right? That there's, the reintegrative shaming versus disintegrative shaming, and that we need to, if we use the disintegrative shaming, then basically the person has already experienced a loss of community, and they probably are not motivated to reintegrate. With whom would I reintegrate, right? Now, in terms of, I was thinking about, your leper example and stuff, and I was thinking about, because this could bring us back to the article, Typhoid Mary. So remember Typhoid,
Mary Mallon wasn't her name?
Yeah. So now Typhoid Mary, the society would have greatly benefited from her feeling shame, right? But she did not. She did not believe that she was a carrier of this disease, and they tried to, incarcerate her basically. Actually, there's an island right outside my window here where they held her for a while. Yeah.
It wasn't it?
Well, here off of, this one's in Massachusetts. So, that's what I've heard, that for a while.
They built a little cottage for her, and apparently her ghost wanders around there as well, apparently.
Yes. And so, to some extent, when people don't know maybe how a disease is transmitted or something, like in terms of, leprosy or something, maybe a little bit of, maybe shame isn't what they should have used, right? But shame was maybe the tool in the short term that they had. And if Typhoid Mary had been a little bit more, taken in the shame a little bit more, she obviously, felt more the disintegrative shame. People tried to shame her, and she was pretty much immune to it, and kept, going into homes and taking on nannying and housekeeping and palliative care jobs. Yeah, cooking and that kind of stuff. So, I do think that, the authors of this article make it sound like it's really super great that we see shame in others and then we conform. And although I think you and I, are probably going to talk about the ways in which we don't think that's true, I don't want to let go of this idea that, again, from an evolutionary perspective, right, from a social coordination function, if we buy into that function as one of the three, I think that shame does have a place, as does guilt, as does embarrassment. Now, you were talking, so I think, I can't remember which example you used, but it made me think of another difference between embarrassment and shame. And
flies open in the class, I think.
Yes, the flies open in the class, yes. So for one thing, we tend to smile, okay? And we tend to blush. And so there is still the downward glance and everything, but there's oftentimes the sort of like sheepish grin, and we blush when we're embarrassed. And those things actually endear you to people. So one of the things that happens when we show evidence of embarrassment is that people will actually sort of circle around us. And you've probably had this happen before, where you something happens that's embarrassing, and like three people come up and tell you their embarrassing story, right?
Yeah.
This happened to me, or something similar happened to me, a year ago, or to my cousin or whatever. People tend to sort of socially prop up the embarrassed, and there are some really cool psychology studies on this phenomenon, where they show people that are either blushing, exact same behavior, or either blushing or not, and then the social support that they get.
My father has a great one. My father, his friend, it's even vicarious. It wasn't his story. And it was exactly very similar. A teacher whose name was Dick, Mr. Dick, you know. And he was introducing himself to a class in an all-girls school, and he had his flies undone. Just his flies, there was nothing else protruding. But
nothing else
he introduced
undone.
himself. Yeah, and he said, "Good afternoon, class. Nice to meet you. My name's Mr. Dick." And you know, the girls in the class were absolutely shrieking, and he had no idea what was going on until, you know, eventually he realized. And but he would happily tell that story and yet blush in the pub, and other people would then, you know, my dad told it to me, and it kind of, but obviously it endeared him to other people. That was the function, even
Right.
though it was slightly painful for him to tell it.
Right. And again, that's in you know, juxtaposition to shame, where people withdraw and others avoid them, right? As opposed to sort of, you know, propping people up with shame and ostracism. The person who's shamed tends to withdraw, and and other people tend to stay away. Again, out of, you know, probably in this disgust, context, not wanting to be contaminated themselves, right? So we avoid that. And, you know, in terms of this article, I'm going to avoid doing that behavior so that I won't be contaminated also. That person, is bad in terms of shame, you know, bad, ugly, dirty, whatever. And so I'm not going to engage in that. And even if it's just that they themselves think of themselves that way, we still don't want to go there, right? We still don't want to be contaminated in that way. So the authors of this article really, are taking the positive spin on that, right? That we are learning from our environment, how to navigate it and how to avoid behaviors that would cause us to be shamed or feel ashamed of ourselves.
Yeah. So, I mean, what they say, you know, in terms of how they use the word positive, they say that, you know, they don't necessarily say that the consequences are overall on balance positive. They just say that shame in this way is essentially good at getting people to abide by norms.
Right.
They don't say whether those norms are good.
Right. And in fact, when I looked at the supplementary materials, I was a little bit shocked to find how quickly people learned. Here are some of the things: deferred to their supervisor's judgment in making a decision, took a long time to make a decision on a project, expressed their personal concerns about strategic direction in a meeting, refused to compromise in a negotiation, presented an aggressive growth estimate in a board meeting, presented a cautious estimate of growth in a board meeting, introduced a client by the last name instead of the first name, or by the first name instead of the last name, shared a personal story in a meeting, wrote their report without getting help from a colleague, wrote their report with getting help from a colleague. So these are all very sort of neutral kinds of behaviors. At the same time, it is a little worrisome that we take these so quickly, right? That we learn these so quickly.
Yeah. So I don't know. When I look at the kind of the discussion section at the end, they talk about things like, well, okay, this was in the North American context. And so, you know, it may be stronger or weaker here than it might be in other contexts. They don't really mention them. But they draw out those possibilities a little bit. And then they kind of end the article with the point that says, you know, and it's a quote from another author, I can't quite recall who, and they say, shame may tell us a great deal about how our civilization functions, or something along those lines. And leave it at that. I don't know. I don't know what you think about this. as you kind of have pointed out, and the authors are correct too as well, is that shame can serve some useful functions. I mean, there are some moral norms that seem to exist across all human societies. So you don't kill somebody without any good reason, for example. And those civilizations that thought you ought to no longer exist, or exist, on the very periphery of civilization. So you can't have a functional civilization or society with that kind of norm in which killing people is perfectly okay, or raping people is perfectly okay. So there are certain norms for which shame as a preventative measure certainly makes some sense and serves as adaptive, first on the individual level, but second on the society level. But I think we have to kind of draw out the two, right? So I think in a roundabout way, and I hope I'm not reading too much in between the lines here, but I think that the authors are making the point that shame is on balance adaptive. That is, it's not necessarily adaptive to the person who's being shamed, although sometimes it might be, but it's maybe on balance maladaptive to the person who's being shamed in many occasions. But the implications of that shame upon other people, of them perceiving what happens to that person, will then make those persons align themselves much better with the prevailing social norms, and therefore benefit as a consequence. I would agree with that on an individual level. But I don't know. The next question we would have to hazard up is that, is it possible wherein adapting to a certain set of social norms because of shame is good for you? That is, it benefits you, you do better, you make more money, you have more friends, you have better access to mates, or whatever. But nevertheless, by adapting to those norms, it's bad for the wider society within which you exist, within which those norms have become, for lack of a better word, normal. What do you think about that?
No, I would agree with that, and I think that the authors, because they had so many studies to talk about, the intro and the discussion were quite brief, and they didn't really go there. But I would totally agree, and that's what I was thinking of when I first saw this article, was how worrisome maybe it is that because shame is the social tool of the moment, I think. Is it possible that maybe it is causing a type of conformity that's actually going to harm society in some ways, undermine some of the social fabric, as opposed to strengthening it, right?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think it's fairly easy to give examples of that, right? So, I mean, I was just thinking, as I was reading this article, and I was kind of thinking of Foucault. Here's a hypothesis. Here's a question for you. Generally speaking, the most unhealthy societies are those which express the greatest amount of normative pressure. And when a society expresses a really, really, really large amount of normative pressure, might that be synonymous with oppression?
I would think that would be entirely possible. And I think that this study would suggest that is true.
Albeit through the back door, right?
Right. And again, I think you're right that sometimes shame, or maybe even, I wouldn't hazard a guess at what percentage of time, that shame is bad maybe for the person feeling shame, but I also think shame is good sometimes for the person. There's a reason why there's a reason why Typhoid Mary was so vilified, right? Because if she had felt more shame about her original, if because that was something impure about herself, right? She really did have something. It certainly wasn't her fault she had the disease, but it was her fault that she kept, maybe spreading it. And so I think that the right kind of shame, is actually productive even sometimes for the person who's feeling it. And it can most certainly become pathological. And there's plenty of research on that also. But I definitely agree that this article makes it look like we're very quick and very, very quick to learn, what might be shameful. Maybe even, no matter how benign the actual behavior appears to be, in writing, right? That we would say that we weren't going to do it just because we saw someone else express shame. And this idea that we're assuming that that downward cast look meant so much, right? That it meant, it spoke volumes, right? Just that downward glance.
Well, indeed, it spoke volumes without any offered up kind of objective or attempted objective analysis of whether the transgression warranted shame or not.
Right.
It was just simply people adjusting to perceived norms. There was no kind of evaluation of those norms. And that's not to suggest what the authors are doing, that the findings are incorrect. I don't think that they are. I mean, I think that people, by and large, most people, most of the time, don't really enter into any significant analysis over social norms. They adjust themselves to the society within which they live, and they use their brains to justify the decisions they've made. They don't generally question things. But that's not good.
Yeah, it doesn't feel good, right? And again, no, I mean, especially right now, when we talked before about this, the replication crisis in psychology. And one of the things that I've said is, to you, but not here, is that I do wonder sometimes if some of that replication crisis is a history effect that, we have, if it's been 20 years since the study was done, then, we can't discount the fact that it's been 20 years. The world, people have experienced different things. The world is very different. And when I was reading this, I wondered, would these results have been as strong, 20 years ago? I don't know. Are people more sensitive now? Because we're looking at each other on screens, for example? I mean, these studies were done online, right? Where they saw, presumably like a little, almost like a little Zoom, meeting.
Anecdotally, obviously, what I'm going to say is now completely unfalsifiable because there is no means to test it, barring a TARDIS turning up in my living room. Anecdotally, I would be fairly confident in saying that the pressure was nothing like the pressure to conform to norms. I mean, certainly with my slightly unusual intellectual habits and curiosities, I was viewed as being eccentric 10, 15 years ago, a little bit odd, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and made for interesting conversations that might even get me invited to places I wouldn't otherwise have been. Certainly quirky and things like that would have been said about me. Now, not so much. I'm much more of a heretic. The pressure to conform. Again, this is all anecdotal, although I suspect that there will be some studies that will bear this out somewhere. Seems orders of magnitude higher now than it ever has been, really, at any point in my own history, save from the first few years of secondary school, junior high school for the States, I guess that would be. Yeah, it's really, really, really strange right now.
Yeah, I do think that, that sort of this idea that people were sort of, maybe quirky, but we got along with them anyway. And the sort of it takes all kinds kind of stuff. And also this, again, these very benign behaviors that, the idea that they were so easily linked with an emotion seems, I don't know. I mean, again, they have very robust findings, over 5 studies plus 2 that were online. And yet I do, like, again, some of this stuff is so benign that it feels, I can't help but wonder how easily it was connected with an emotion that includes, again, sort of a contamination sequence for telling a story in a meeting, or presenting positive corporate growth statistics in a meeting. I don't know.
So, I mean, so I've started to kind of think about this, and I started to think back historically. Can I think of examples? So what it really got me thinking about is the zeitgeist, right? The spirit of the age. So the spirit of the age has certain norms which exist from the spirit prior to today. So, for example, if we look at within our own society, if we look at the norms against stealing, murdering, and so on, those kind of things that would be codified right now as criminal offences, by and large, they endure, right? So, if I was to say to your great-great-grandmother, stealing, this is bad, she'd probably say, well, absolutely, of course. It's in the Bible, after all. Probably 1,000 years ago would get the same result, right? And today would get the same result too. Taking somebody else's property is not a good thing to do. There might be caveats if the person has stolen it from somebody else, or if you're starving and you don't have anything to eat. But by and large, within the normal remit of moral analysis, would say that these things are wrong, and these truths seem to pass all the way down. But that's not true for all things that people have been passionately in favor of. So, for example, I mean, we kind of talked about this before in another conversation, but the trial of Oscar Wilde in 1895, who was basically thrown in prison for being gay. And, we have lots of gay friends. We know that they're not doing anybody harm. They have their gay partners. They make each other wonderfully happy. We recognize that that's a great thing. We'd happily associate with them, and we'd be very much against somebody telling them, or somebody telling even their own children, that such people are irredeemably evil or anything like that. I mean, that's of course. I mean, that the zeitgeist of our age right now strikes us as of course that's perfectly okay. And those people who contradict that zeitgeist, we look at them with consternation, if not disbelief. And yet, not that long ago, 1895, the guy who was the judge in that case, his name was Sir Alfred Wills. And, after Oscar Wilde and his lawyers, because Oscar Wilde, one of the greatest writers who has ever lived, presents this beautiful case that's really well argued, Alfred Wills then says,
well, I can only give you the maximum sentence that I could possibly give, and I will happily give you this maximum sentence, but it is not enough. I wish I could give you more.
And to which the crowd that had assembled were whooping and clapping, because those were the norms. Mm-hmm. And if you were one of those people that were whooping and clapping, your behavior was adaptive. It would have got you social status. It would have got you acceptance. It would have made the people around you like you, right? It was adaptive on an individual level. But on a society level, that's an awful thing to do. I mean, you've hamstrung one of the greatest writers in the history of mankind. But, maybe you don't care about literature. Another example, Alan Turing. You know Alan Turing? Mm-hmm. The creator of the Enigma machine, a massive genius who managed to decode the Nazi code that they were communicating and sending all of their troops all around Europe and invading places and fighting different battles here, there, and there. And they were really confident because they got this really good code, and they did have a really good code, but he was really smart. He managed to figure out how to break that code. Saved God knows how many lives, brought to an end the Nazi regime quicker than it otherwise would have been. And yet the guy was absolutely shamed. He was convicted in the 50s of being gay. And he was basically given an option. You violated these norms for which there is no decent basis that we can recognize today. In fact, we see the norms of yesteryear then. This is in the 50s. This is well within living memory. Right? We see them as being absolute anathema. And yet he was given a choice between, you can either go to prison or you can have hormonal treatment, which mutilated him, right? He was, he started growing breast tissue. He was incredibly shamed, not just for being gay, which is nothing to be ashamed about, you know, as we recognize now, but because of the horrible things that these hormones, or the, not necessarily horrible, but the undesired things that these hormones were doing to his body. And so, you know, our best guess is that he killed himself with cyanide. And what have we lost? The guy was 41 when he died.
Oh, really? 41?
Yeah, 41 when he died. You know, he'd broken this amazing code against, you know, and well, we don't know, saved a lot of lives at the very least. But he was 41. What kind of contribution could he have gone on to make? If he had died at 50, if he had died at 60, what contribution could he have gone on to make? And so this kind of norm enforcement of these norms that seem like, well, of course they're absolutely right, and everybody who disagrees with me is in some way morally impure or evil or should be discredited or cast out to society. That is what in many ways stops the progress of society. Certainly with Turing, if not with Wilde.
Yeah. So, and this gets back to what you were talking about during our last recording about sort of the vast majority of people who are just simply silent on these things, right? Again, both of, Oscar Wilde and Turing, completely benign behaviors that had nothing to do with, they weren't bothering anybody, right? That were then, subject to shame and most people, I mean, certainly as you described in the Oscar Wilde and the whooping and the carrying on and everything, but the majority of people weren't in the courtroom, right? They just went on with their lives and just ignored it. And so, yeah, I think that, that's sort of the scary part of this study. I thought the most convincing, study was the one where they offered people a way to make more money by engaging in the behavior that was supposedly shameful. So by cheating, so they had to generate a list of words, of rhyming words. And if they generated a certain number, they were paid an extra quarter. So these are participants who were being paid to be in a study through either MTurk or Prolific. I can't remember which that study was. So they were being paid for their participation, and they got an extra quarter, I think, for each word that they generated beyond a certain number, whether they cheated or not. And then everybody got, an extra, 15 cents a word beyond something else. So they could have made more money within the, by participating in the study if they, asked for the list, which would have made their own list look longer. So they would be primed with 5 or 6 words to start, and then every word that they generated beyond that would make them more money. So it was, somewhat cheating, right? And to make more money in the study. And I thought that one was the most convincing because participants who saw that ostensibly, a Confederate participant, not a real participant, had cheated and looked, used those prompts and looked shameful. The participants who saw that were less likely to use the prompts or cheat, basically. I thought that was a a much more convincing study in terms of the benefits of shame than the ones that were offering up these very benign behaviors in conjunction with a shameful body language. I thought, okay, well, if people see that I don't know, the Bernie Madoffs or whatever of the world, are ashamed, then maybe they won't engage in Ponzi schemes, right?
Good. And so to conclude, perhaps I would like to ask you a question that I've asked you before, but not in this sphere. Why would then somebody who might be described as a little bit mad, like me, be willing to walk headfirst into a wall of shame in order to call out social norms that they perceive as being, well, not just me. I think a lot of people are listening to this, and you as well. What people like us, people who, we could probably have an easier time if we just allowed ourselves to be shamed, shut up, retreated.
Right. I'm sure there's lots of answers. Yeah, there's lots of answers to this question that don't have to do with this article and what we've been talking about. So I won't talk about any of those, but I will just go back to what we said about this idea about a loss of community and how shame basically doesn't work once you have been, once you've experienced a loss of community. There's really there's for many of us, we don't feel as though we can go back. So we are, essentially contaminated or, ostracized, and don't feel comfortable, sort of associating ourselves with the group from which we have been cast out. And so there's no real motivation. And one of the things that the research shows is that people who've been shamed in this disintegrative kind of way actually end up getting, guess what? Angry. So they don't withdraw. Many of them don't withdraw the way that you would, the way that sort of this group wants them to do, right? Is you should withdraw. You should, set yourself away from the group. You don't belong. In fact, many of these people, so anger would be an approach emotion. Okay. So we think about, withdrawal emotions would be more like, depression and sadness and sort of in fact, some people would say that depression doesn't have a function, but I think that it functions as sort of a power down, sort of like it's too hot, right? Your computer's too hot and it has to power down. So we sort of have to power down and maybe think about you mentioned this early on, sort of the actual self, the ideal self, and the ought self. You talked about oughts, right? And so if we're continuously not meeting the ideal self and we're feeling, disappointed or whatever, then we might withdraw and reevaluate. So there's anger, though, is an approach emotion. And so what you're describing is why is it that people who are shamed and should be withdrawing are actually engaging in approach? And I don't know the reason for that, but I do know that some research suggests that people who are shamed in this disintegrative way don't do what society thinks that they ought to do. They don't withdraw, and they actually engage in this approach with some anger.
That seems to describe both of us, I think. It's really interesting also just what you said there on depression. Certainly, like, I went through some fairly bleak periods of black dog depression in my early 20s. And I kind of felt that I went into them a different person to the person I came out. I kind of re-emerged as an entirely different character altogether. Good. All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we can probably end it there. This is certainly a topic that we can return to. Shame, because it seems to be something and I think probably a great deal of people listening right now will be labeling under. So thank you very much. All right.